One of the most respected pundits in the paddock and an award-winning broadcaster, many regard Martin Brundle as the best F1 driver to never win a race. A Le Mans and Daytona winner, the super quick Brundle went toe-to-toe with Ayrton Senna in British Formula 3, but never quite got his hands on the machinery needed to fully show his talent in Formula 1. Nevertheless, he netted 9 podiums in his 158-race F1 career and earned a reputation as one of the smartest drivers of all time.
I don't have one of these.
1996 would be Martin Brundle's final year in Grand Prix racing, but it started in spectacular fashion. At the inaugural race around Melbourne's Albert Park circuit, the Jordan driver had a big incident on the run-down to turn 3, as McLaren's David Coulthard swerved left towards Johnny Herbert's Sauber, and Brundle was left with nowhere to go.
Wow, that's one of the Jordans! This is what we feared at this corner, and that looks very nasty indeed. Red flag has gone out. It's Martin Brundle, and miracle of miracles. This is well nigh unbelievable. Martin Brundle gets out of the car and he is seemingly all right.
His car was literally broken in two and was left upside down in the gravel. But amazingly, Brundle climbed out unscathed. With the race red flagged, after a quick check-up with F1 doctor Professor Sid Watkins, the brave Brundle sprinted back to the garage to jump in the spare car for the restart in a show of incredible mental fortitude. Sadly, his race was over after just one lap when he made contact with Pedro Diniz, again at turn 3, and spun off. But the very fact Brundle thought nothing of climbing back into the car and going racing again just minutes after walking away from one of the most terrifying crashes of his career tells you everything you need to know about his courage and hunger to compete. In 1983, Brundle pushed Ayrton Senna all the way for the British F3 Championship, ultimately losing out to the Brazilian at the final race of the year. His reward was a seat at motorsport's top table, with F1 now well into the turbo era, but his once mighty Tyrrell team was still running a less powerful, naturally aspirated engine, the only team on the grid to do so for the whole season. But if Brundle was already at a disadvantage before a wheel was turned that year, he certainly didn't let it show. At the season-opening Brazilian Grand Prix at Jacarepaguá, he outqualified his talented teammate Stefan Beloff by half a second, and then raced from 18th on the grid to an incredible P5 at the flag, sealing a points finish on his Formula 1 debut. Sadly for Brundle, he would later be stripped of the incredible result, after Tyrrell were disqualified from the entire season for a technical infringement, around their putting ballast into the fuel tanks to escape minimum weight requirements. But it was still an astonishing debut drive from the new boy, who had proved he was one of the best in the world. Brundle drove for 8 F1 teams and some big names, but his 1989 Brabham was far from their title-winning heyday, and he had to pre-qualify for the 1989 season. Though when it came to qualifying itself, Brundle stunned the paddock by sticking his car 4th on the grid. In the race, Brundle was running strongly around the streets of Monte Carlo and was on course for his first official podium finish. But he was forced to pit when his battery failed and heartbreakingly dropped down the order. He was eventually classified 6th as his teammate Stefano Modena took advantage and finished 3rd, his first podium and only points finish of the year. Brundle's wait for a top 3 finish continued, but he'd impressed plenty in the paddock with his incredible qualifying lap and remarkable composure on the most challenging circuit on the calendar. Martin Brundle and Ayrton Senna shared the podium an incredible 14 times across the 1983 British F3 season. But it would be almost a decade before they would stand together on the rostrum again, at the 1992 Italian Grand Prix. Brundle was by now driving for Benetton, And though he qualified only 9th, he used his trademark impeccable race management to stay out of trouble and bring his car home in 2nd place, behind Senna and ahead of his Benetton teammate, a young Michael Schumacher. It was Brundle's first ever P2 finish, and the only time he stood shoulder to shoulder on the podium with his old rival Senna in motorsport's top tier.
Had a poor start, which is unusual, we both did, and had to be quite aggressive in the first few laps. When I emerged from Ferraris and that, I was 16 seconds behind Ayrton. I could keep that gap for some time, but I was working my tyres much too hard. I couldn't, I was going to have to make a pit stop if I carried on driving at that speed.
It's often forgotten that Brundle drove for Williams in Formula One, perhaps because he only raced in one Grand Prix for the storied British outfit. After years of driving poor cars for underfunded teams, in 1988 Brundle was persuaded to step away from Formula One, and he was instantly a success, winning the 24 Hours of Daytona and the World Sports Car Championship with Jaguar. But he kept his hand in F1 by working as test driver with Williams. And when Nigel Mansell was hit with a bout of chickenpox, Sir Frank called up Brundle to race the FW12 in the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps. It was a tall order, having not raced F1 machinery all year, and Brundle had to readjust to the demands of single-seater driving with very little prep time. But he managed to qualify in P12, having actually been fastest of all in the wet second qualifying session on Saturday.
Quickest in the rain gave me some pleasure to be a bit quicker than Senna in the rain. We'll have to wait and see what tomorrow brings. Stay out of trouble in that first hairpin, I hope. That's always a difficult problem here at Spa.
On race day, he brought the car home safely to finish 7th, as Ayrton Senna led home teammate Alain Prost for a 1-2 that clinched the Constructors' Championship for McLaren. Brundle may have just missed out on points that day, but his impressive drive at short notice, coupled with his winning exploits in sports cars, made the F1 paddock sit up and take notice once more. And the following year, he was back with Brabham. Brundle caught the eye of many team bosses in his debut season, but no performance was more eye-catching than his incredible 2nd place at the Detroit Grand Prix. Despite Tyrrell running normally aspirated engines instead of their quicker turbo-powered rivals, Brundle, starting 11th, charged his way up the field in the shadow of the Detroit skyscrapers. There were plenty of retirements that day, but this wasn't just a case of waiting for other cars to drop out. Brundle was scything his way through the field and pulled off a great move on Elio De Angelis for 2nd place. Then he set about hunting down leader Nelson Piquet and had closed up to within a second of the Brabham when the checkered flag fell. Brundle was on the podium in his first season in F1, but as in Brazil, he would later be stripped of the result when Tyrrell were excluded from the entire season. Nevertheless, it was a brilliant performance from the rookie, who might have even won had the race been just a little bit longer. Brundle never quite made it to the very top step of the podium in Formula One, though there were a number of races when he got very close indeed. The 1992 Belgian Grand Prix was one of them, but rather than Brundle, it was his Benetton teammate Michael Schumacher who took his first F1 victory that day at the Spa-Francorchamps track. Having qualified 9th, Brundle had worked his way up the field in a wet-dry race and was running directly behind Schumacher when the German made a mistake and slid off the track. But when Schumacher rejoined, he was right behind Brundle and could see that his wet tyres were starting to blister on the drying track surface, and immediately pitted for slicks a lap before Brundle did likewise. It would prove to be the decisive move of the race, as the early stop gave Schumacher a strategic advantage, leading to the first of his 91 wins. For Brundle, it was a case of what might have been, on a day when, had he pitted one lap earlier, it could have been him finally spraying the champagne as a Grand Prix winner. In his long F1 career, Martin Brundle drove for plenty of championship-winning teams, but he often had the misfortune to be driving for them when they weren't at their best. In 1994, he joined the mighty McLaren, but the once dominant British outfit were in a rare fallow spell, and with new engine partner Peugeot in their first year in Formula One, often struggled for results and reliability. McLaren would finish the year having failed to take a Grand Prix win for the first time since 1980. But Brundle did secure the next best thing, with a P2 finish at Monaco, on a sombre race weekend when the sport mourned Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger, who had been killed just 2 weeks earlier at Imola. As the race got underway, Brundle immediately moved up from 8th on the grid to 5th, and then jumped Jean Alesi and Christian Fittipaldi when they pitted. He was running in 3rd with some 30 laps to go when Mark Blundell's Tyrrell dumped oil on the track at Saint-Devote, right in front of leader Michael Schumacher. The German just managed to avoid it, but Gerhard Berger, running 2nd, slipped and spun on the same patch of oil. He got going again, but now he was in Brundle's clutches, with the Englishman pulling off a great overtaking move at Mirabeau. Unlike 5 years earlier in Monte Carlo, there would be no stopping the brilliant Brundle, who finally stood on the podium at F1's most famous race. Having been robbed of his rookie season podiums in 1984, Brundle had no idea he'd be forced to wait a very long time before he made it back onto the rostrum. But he finally did it in 1992, some 8 years after he made his debut. Brundle had come close to officially breaking his podium duck in the past, only for bad luck to rob him of his chance. And the same fate so very nearly befell him at the 1992 French Grand Prix at Magny-Cours. After starting P7, he was up to 4th on lap 1, which became 3rd on lap 10 when Gerhard Berger's engine blew. The race was red flagged and then restarted again following heavy rain, and Brundle was still running in 3rd when his Benetton's engine started cutting out in right-hand corners. He was just thinking he was going to have to retire the car when the rain started falling again, and with the reduced speeds and lower G-force demands that came from running in the wet, the problem disappeared. But his troubles weren't over yet, and as the laps ticked down, and with that elusive podium getting tantalisingly closer and closer, he spun on a patch of oil at the final chicane, but managed to keep the engine running, and eventually crossed the line for a brilliant 3rd place. Now he was a podium finisher in Formula One, and this time it was official.
I'm delighted for the team, and I'm pleased that I could come home and show my true abilities, and the team is running very, very well, and we're looking forward to the second half of the season. We're looking forward to some Union Jacks next week at the British Grand Prix.
All eyes were on Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher at the 1995 Belgian Grand Prix, as the two title rivals fought an intense battle for victory around the Spa-Francorchamps track. But behind them, Martin Brundle put in one of the best drives of his career in a far less competitive car to take a brilliant podium finish. At one of those dark, wet attrition races that Spa so often throws up, Brundle used all his skill to keep out of trouble and work his way up from P13 on the grid, jumping up to 9th in the first few laps before running a longer first stint than some of the cars in front of him, which put him P4 by the time the rain started to fall. He pitted at the halfway point to overcut his Ligier teammate Olivier Panis for 3rd, and then took 2nd place when Hill was forced to serve a stop-go penalty for speeding in the pit lane. When the Englishman got back on track with just a few laps to go, he set about catching Brundle, who, in his slower car, performed heroics to try to keep the Williams behind him, defending valiantly at La Source before finally having to concede the position at Les Combes on the final lap. Nonetheless, Brundle had scored a podium in an unfancied car on a day when plenty of other drivers had been caught out by the conditions. Driving with skill, precision, determination and bravery to take the checkered flag ahead of every driver, bar the two title contenders.
This is a good result for the team. We all started a long way back on the grid. Maybe that's the secret of racing at Spa. We had a great strategy, a one-stop strategy.
In many ways, it was a drive that epitomised his career in F1. Battling against the odds in a car that didn't match his talent, Brundle had used all his years of experience, race smarts and speed to pull off a superb result in difficult conditions. It would be his 9th and final podium in F1 before he swapped driving for commentating at the end of the following season. And though he never got the Grand Prix victory his talent deserved, he retired as one of the most respected drivers amongst his peers to have ever raced in the sport.